The fog ripped open, the pyro fired straight into the air, and she walked out in gear more dangerous than anything WWE has seen this year. Fans didn't cheer, they screamed, "She's back!" And this entrance defines 2025. But to understand why that scream mattered, we have to look at the 60 seconds before the music hit. The arena was in a state of restless fatigue. We have all seen it before. It was the middle of the show. The crowd was checking their phones, and the energy was dipping into that familiar lull where the magic feels distant. The lighting in the arena was the standard, high-gloss production. We are used too bright, sterile, and safe. The wrestling world in 2025 had become polished to a fault, a perfect machine of predictable outcomes and managed reactions. The fans were waiting for something, anything, to break the perfectly manufactured rhythm of the night. Then the anomaly happened. It wasn't a sound. It was a removal of sound. The audio feed in the arena didn't just cut out. It felt like it was sucked into a vacuum. The massive LED screens that ring the stadium, usually blindingly bright with advertisements and graphics, flickered and died. For a terrifying 3 seconds, 20,000 people sat in absolute pitch-black darkness. This wasn't the scripted darkness of a spooky character we know. This felt like a power failure. It felt like a mistake. In that moment of genuine confusion, the collective heartbeat of the audience synchronized. The boredom vanished, replaced instantly by a primal alertness. Stickman figures in the crowd would be seen lowering their phones, their heads tilting up, eyes widening in the void. They weren't watching a show anymore. They were trapped in a room where the lights had just gone out, and something was breathing in the dark with them. When the light finally returned, it didn't flood the arena. It bled in. A single crimson spotlight pierced the center of the stage, revealing a silhouette that didn't belong in the modern era of sports entertainment. The figure stood motionless, draped in materials that looked less like spandex and more like armor scavenged from a wasteland. This was the dangerous gear the internet would spend the next month dissecting. It wasn't flashy. It was jagged. It looked heavy, burdened with history, covered in spikes and distressed leather that suggested a journey through hell, not a trip from the locker room. The pyro that followed wasn't the celebratory fireworks we are used to. It was a concussive blast, a wall of gray smoke that rolled over the first few rows like a physical wave. And then she stepped through. The walk was different. In 2024, she walked with the confidence of a superstar. In 2025, she walked with the predatory stalking of a hunter. The scream that erupted from the crowd wasn't the pop of recognition. It was a visceral, high-pitched shriek of disbelief. You could hear the vocal cords of thousands of people tearing at once. It was the sound of a crowd realizing they had been lied to. They were told she was gone. They were told she was finished. Seeing her there, looking like a warlord rather than an athlete, short-circuited the logic of the night. The camera caught the faces in the front row, grown men clutching their heads, children freezing in place. It wasn't joy, it was shock. The entrance didn't just signal a match. It signaled that the safety rails were off. The atmosphere shifted from entertainment to danger in a single heartbeat. While the camera focused on the returning icon, the true story was being told inside the ring. The opponent, a champion who had spent the last year claiming she was untouchable, was selling the moment with a realism that made people uncomfortable. Usually in wrestling, the person in the ring reacts with anger or defiance when interrupted. They shout at the referee. They wave the newcomer on. But here the reaction was stillness. The champion dropped her title belt. It wasn't a scripted drop. It slipped from her fingers and hit the canvas with a dull thud that the microphones barely picked up. The animation of this moment would show the champion shrinking. Her posture, usually tall and dominant, collapsed inward. She backed away until her spine hit the turnbuckle, trapped. This was the narrative genius of the entrance. It stripped the current roster of their power without a single punch being thrown. The returning star was walking down the ramp with a slow, deliberate cadence, ignoring the fans entirely. She wasn't playing to the crowd. She was locked onto her target. The referee, usually an invisible figure meant to enforce rules, looked genuinely confused, glancing toward the timekeeper's area as if asking, "Is this supposed to happen?" This layer of uncertainty is what creates legendary television. The opponent's eyes tracked the approaching figure, widening with every step. We witnessed the dismantling of a character's confidence in real time. The champion, who had defeated everyone, suddenly looked like a child who had lost their parents in a crowd. It was a masterclass in nonverbal storytelling, proving that presence is far more lethal than any maneuver. The second layer of immersion came from the commentary team. In modern wrestling, commentators are often overproduced, shouting buzzwords and hashtags to get topics trending. But during this entrance, the lead announcer did something brilliant. He stopped talking. For a full 20 seconds, eternity in television, there was only the roar of the crowd and the ominous industrial hum of the new theme music. When he finally spoke, his voice was dropped to a harsh whisper. He didn't scream her name. He didn't run down her accolades. He simply asked, "What has she become?" This reaction validated the viewer's feeling that something was wrong. If the voice of the company sounded unsettled, then the viewer at home was allowed to feel unsettled too. The color commentator, usually the one to make jokes or analyze strategy, was audibly stuttering. They were fumbling through their notes, the sound of paper shuffling audible over the broadcast. They were selling the idea that this return was not on the format sheet. They were reacting not as employees, but as witnesses to a car crash. They spoke about the gear, the dark colors, the lack of branding, the sheer grit of it speculating on where she had been. They didn't treat it like a sports return. They treated it like a character re-emerging from a wilderness. By stripping away the polished WWE style of commentary, they allowed the raw emotion of the entrance to breathe. The confusion in their voices mirrored the confusion in the arena, creating a feedback loop of tension that made the screen feel like it was vibrating. If we could peel back the curtain and look at the gorilla position, the nerve center of the show just behind the entrance curtain, we would see a scene of controlled chaos. In our story, this entrance wasn't just a surprise to the fans. It was designed to look like a surprise to the production team. The director in the truck, usually calling out camera shots with military precision, ready 1, take 1, ready 2, take 2, was likely scrambling. The camera angles weren't the standard smooth pans. They were shaky, zoomed in too close, or slightly out of focus. This verite style of filming subconsciously told the audience that the cameramen were unprepared. Imagine the animated visual of the production truck, screens flashing red. Audio levels peaking into the red zones because the crowd noise was louder than the equipment could handle. The producers were likely shouting to cut to a wide shot to capture the scale of the reaction. But the floor cameras were mesmerized, glued to the terrifying figure walking down the ramp. This breakdown in the polished presentation is essential. When the production feels perfect, it feels fake. When the cameraman struggles to keep the subject in frame because the crowd is pushing against the barricade, it feels real. This entrance broke the fourth wall of production. It felt like an invasion. The lighting cues were mistimed. Shadows fell across her face at odd angles, and that imperfection made her look even more monstrous. It suggested that she wasn't following the script. She was dictating the pace, and the billion-dollar machine was struggling to keep up with her. The most underrated aspect of a return like this is how it affects the ecosystem of the locker room. In the narrative we are building, the other wrestlers were watching on monitors in the back. Usually they watch with professional interest. Tonight, they watched with professional dread. The scream from the crowd wasn't just excitement. It was the sound of the hierarchy changing. Every wrestler in the back knew that their spot on the card, their screen time, and their relevance had just been threatened. The animation here would be stark. A room full of colorful, larger-than-life characters falling silent, staring at a small TV screen. The returning stars, geared dangerous, unbranded, Violent made the rest of the roster look like they were wearing costumes. She made them look like they were playing pretend. This is the emotional weight of the return. It wasn't just that she was back, it was that she had evolved past them. She had found a darkness they were afraid to touch. The fear in the locker room wasn't physical, it was existential. They saw the way the crowd screamed for her, not cheered, screamed and realized that the audience was starving for something real. She was the reality check. The jealousy, the awe, and the sudden insecurity of the roster added a thick layer of tension to the air. The story wasn't just about her return, it was about how she made everyone else feel suddenly inadequate. While the entrance was still happening, the digital world was already melting down. The scream in the arena was echoed by a scream across social media. In 2025, the reaction is instantaneous. Within seconds, the hashtag of her name didn't just trend, it dominated, but the tone of the conversation was different. It wasn't the usual, "she looks great" or "dream match" comments. The comments were frantic. Is she okay? She looks terrifying. Did you see the champion's face? Fans were screenshotting the freeze frame of her eyes, cold, dead, devoid of the smile she used to carry. They were dissecting the gear, noticing symbols or scratches that hinted at a dark backstory. The internet became a detective agency, trying to piece together where she had been. This digital chaos is a crucial part of the modern wrestling narrative. The entrance wasn't just for the people in the building. It was designed to break the internet. The blurred images, the shaky fan cam footage uploaded in real time, showing the pyro smoke consuming the first few rosettes, all added to the mythology. The story was no longer contained within the 3 ropes of the ring. It had spilled out into the world. The narrative hook was mystery. Why did she change? What broke her? The fans weren't just watching a show. They were suddenly participating in a lore hunt, desperate to understand the monster that had just walked through the smoke. Amidst the noise and the pyro, there is a quiet, tragic element to this story. To return with gear this dangerous, to elicit a scream rather than a cheer, implies a loss of innocence. The character we knew is dead. The animated visual here shifts to a slower, melancholic tone. We see a split screen. On the left, the bright, smiling superstar she was years ago, waving to kids, wearing bright colors. On the right, the shadowed, armored figure standing in the ring today. This contrast is heartbreaking. It tells a story of survival. The narrative suggests that during her time away, she didn't rest. She endured. The scream from the fans was a recognition of her trauma. They weren't just reacting to a cool entrance. They were reacting to the visible scars on her character. The silence she held in the ring spoke louder than any promo. It was a moment of heavy reflection. Family she left behind, the injuries she rehabilitated, the politics she fought. It was all worn on her face like a map. This section of the story humanizes the monster. It reminds us that the most dangerous characters in wrestling are often the ones who have been hurt the most. The dangerous gear wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a defense mechanism. She armored herself against the world that chewed her up, and that tragedy is what made the fans connect with her on a visceral, emotional level. The music finally faded. The pyro smoke cleared, leaving a thin haze hanging over the ring. The champion and the returning exile stood 10 feet apart. The referee, realizing he was invisible in this moment, stepped back to the ropes. The crowd, after screaming their lungs out, fell into a hush so deep you could hear the air conditioning of the arena. This is the hook that keeps viewers watching the standoff. She didn't attack. She didn't speak. She simply raised her hand. It was a slow, deliberate movement. The champion flinched, expecting a strike. But the hand just hovered there, offering nothing. It was a psychological dismantling. The returning star walked a slow circle around the champion, inspecting her like a predator inspecting a wounded animal. The camera caught the micro-expressions, the champion's lip quivering, the exile's eyes dead and focused. This wasn't a fight, it was a judgment. The audience realized that the match wasn't going to happen tonight. This was about establishing dominance. By not fighting, she proved she was above the violence. She was the storm that could wait. She leaned in close, whispered something inaudible to the champions, something that made the champion's eyes widen in horror and then simply turned her back. Turning your back on an opponent is the ultimate insult. It says you are not a threat to me. The twist came as she walked back up the ramp. We expected her to turn around and bask in the glory, to raise her arms and accept the adulation. That is what wrestling stars do, but she didn't. She stopped at the top of the stage, where the fog was still swirling. She looked back at the sea of fans who had screamed for her. The twist was in her expression. It wasn't anger. It wasn't triumph. It was pity. The camera zoomed in for one final, extreme close-up. A single tear cut a clean line through the grime on her cheek. The narrative flipped in an instant. She wasn't a monster who had come to destroy the company. She was a savior who had come to save it, but she knew the cost would be her own soul. The scream of the fans wasn't fear. It was a desperate plea for her to burn it all down so something new could grow. The dangerous gear wasn't for her protection. It was a funeral shroud for the era she was about to end. As she vanished back into the darkness, the screen faded to black, leaving the audience with the chilling realization she didn't come back to win a championship. She came back to end the game. The entrance didn't define 2025 because it was loud. It defined 2025 because it was the moment the wrestling world realized that the heroes they wanted were the ones who were willing to become villains to save them.